The right to bear arms remains important both in practice and as an emblem down through the years. When the Normans invade England, they certainly have ideas about bringing the populace under control that are dangerous to freedom, so much so that ultimately John is dragged to Runnymede and forced to seal Magna Carta by an armed citizenry. But it's also noteworthy that there's still slavery in Saxon England. It's gradually dying out, but it persists into Norman times. And there's an elaborate ceremony if you choose to free somebody. It's quite similar in England to the same practices on the continent, with one critical difference. In England, when you free somebody, one of the emblems of it, part of the ceremony, you give them arms. You couldn't have a clearer statement than that free men have the right to be armed, and that being disarmed means you are no longer a free man. All I have to say is Sherwood Forest, and right away you see him, clad in Lincoln green with his merry men and his trusty longbow, Robin Hood, perhaps meeting here at the Major Oak, already reputed to be a rallying point for the merry men when it was described by Major Hayman Rooke back in 1790. It's an incredible tree, something like 33 feet around, probably weighs 23 tons. Its canopy extends over 90 feet. Its estimated age between 800 and 1100 years. But the tree is nothing to the figure of Robin Hood, his enduring appeal in books, in movies, in popular culture, played by actors from Douglas Fairbanks to Kevin Costner. He's already mentioned in medieval sources. He's in Piers Plowman. But why? What makes Robin Hood so iconic? Why is he the archetypal Englishman? Because when oppressed, he resists, and he resists effectively. The longbow is a critical part of the story. And Robin Hood's longbow reminds us of an important point about the right to bear arms. It's not about guns. They get most of the attention in the modern world because, of course, they are the most effective weapon for personal protection as well as for military purposes. But back in the 14th century, it was the longbow. Before that, it was the pike staff or the sword. And the right to bear arms meant that whatever you needed to defend yourself against criminals, against invaders, even against your own government if it turned on you, you had the right to own that weapon. And you think of Robin Hood, he's such an icon, not despite being armed, but because he is armed. And Robin Hood is an outlaw, but he's only an outlaw because the government has become oppressive. He struggles against tyranny, dreaming of the return of good government. He does not want to be king, he wants good King Richard back. Now, Richard I is actually a rather implausible figure to be the center of your hopes for good government. He was pretty much as bad as his brother John, just less dangerous because he wasn't around a lot. And in fact, the real Robin Hood didn't live in the 12th century. So I've never quite gotten over the fact, we learned in a first-year history course, Legend, Myth, and History, that whereas there is an actual historical figure at the center of the Arthur legends, this leader of the Romanized Britons after the legions leave, there is no actual Robin Hood. Or rather, there are all kinds of Robin Hoods. You know, he's now associated with Sherwood Forest, and Sherwood Forest is incredibly lush. What a great place for the merry men to hide. I used to wonder how you'd conceal yourself among tree trunks, but I'm telling you, in this place, you could be 7 feet from the Sheriff of Nottingham, and he'd never know you were there until you jumped out at him. But there are plenty of other places in England where Robin Hood could have been. It used to be a kind of cliche saying in English courts when your adversary was wandering too far from the point, you'd say, Robin Hood in Barnesdale stood. And Barnesdale's in South Yorkshire. Robin Hood could have been in the West Country. He could have been anywhere, because Robin Hood is the spirit of English armed resistance to tyranny. Remember, Robin Hood, despite what some people say, does not steal from the rich. He is not a precursor to Karl Marx. What he does is he takes back from the rich what they have stolen from the poor, and he gives it back to the poor. And eventually, the legend in its mature form, set in the time of Prince John, waiting for good King Richard the Lionheart to come back from the Crusades, he becomes a Saxon, Robin of Locksley, dispossessed by these autocratic Normans who are stealing from the English their birthright of liberty. So he's connected with the struggle for Magna Carta. Interestingly enough, the longbow is a tip-off that if he had existed, he wouldn't have lived in that time, because the longbow's not that important a weapon in the 12th century. It really becomes significant in the 13th and 14th centuries, to the point that Edward III actually bans football because it's distracting people from archery practice. Now, football, of course, to the British is soccer to North Americans, but soccer back then was not the civilized game that it isn't today. It was a kind of cross-country brawl in which the inhabitants of two villages would try to kick an inflated pig's bladder all the way to the other village and then into their church. Hundreds of people were involved. There were no rules. Mayhem was common. Injury, even death, was not unknown. But the English knew, even then, not to shoot at one another while playing it, because they might be lethal while engaged in sports, but they were responsible citizens. They were people whose king trusted them to go armed, in fact, insisted that they go armed. It was, from the time of Henry III, a legal requirement that able-bodied people have weapons. If you were rich, you had to have, proper mail and a horse. If you were merely well-to-do, you better have at least a sword and an iron cap. If you were a serf, at least have a stabbing thing, and a scythe. Anything will do. If the English were dangerous to one another in a sporting event, when they handled weapons, they knew how to respect them, and they used them to protect one another, to rally to the defense of their homes, their community, and at need, their kingdom. That's why kings insisted that the subjects be armed. As late as the time of Henry VIII, there's a rule that every family, when a son reaches the age of 7, they must provide him with a bow and 2 arrows and make sure he knows how to use them. If they don't, they get fined 6 shillings and 8 pence a month, and that was a lot of money in those days. So yes, Robin Hood, though he never actually existed, has existed throughout English history in the person of the common people, determined to have their rights, understanding that to have your rights, you must sometimes defend them, not just against criminals, but against tyrannical governments like that of King John. And on down through the ages, the Stuarts, the threat of foreign invasion. The English are ready with the weapons their government has encouraged them to possess and know how to use. And that is why the English have remained free. The idea that they couldn't be armed appealed only to those who did not want to respect their rights. As the late George Jonas once said, "Show me someone who doesn't respect the right to self-defense, and I'll show you a friend of the Sheriff of Nottingham." That is part of the English heritage, and it's part of our heritage too. In times of danger, we rally to this day at the Major Oak.